Here in Washington, D.C., Andrea Murta, she's the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Latin America Center. With us from Moscow is Maxim Mikhailov. He focuses on the Asia-Pacific region for the Russian Academy of Sciences. Saurabh Gupta is an Asia-Pacific International Relations Analyst and a resident senior fellow with the Institute for China-America Studies. And joining us from Beijing is Xindu Xu, and Xindu is a political analyst with China Radio International. Welcome to you all. We are told to think of BRICS as a giant leafy tree, protecting the 5 member nations and then hopefully one day protecting much of the rest of the world economies as well. Let's hear what the respected Foreign Minister of China, Wang Yi, has to say on the eve of the conference getting underway in the Chinese city of Xiamen.
BRICS is not an exclusive club. The impact of BRICS cooperation reaches far beyond the 5 countries. The BRICS mechanism has become an important platform of solidarity for emerging markets and developing countries to enhance cooperation and safeguard common rights and interests. It also plays an increasingly important role in promoting international peace and development.
Now, when President Xi took over the chairmanship of the BRICS nations for the year of 2017, he wrote to everybody and said, let's get together in August and let's have a conversation about how we have done in the previous 8 years or so. Let's take stock, in other words, but let's also try and come up with a blueprint to throw things forward into the future. Let's go to you, Xindu Xu, China Radio International in Beijing. Now, the countries cooperate on areas like hydropower and nuclear power, financial interests, of course, and I think that's how they hope to take things forward in the future. Also, IT. In your opinion, do you think that the BRICS experiment has lived up to its expectations, or has it even exceeded them?
Well, it's really about what kind of expectation you have. Of course, there are different opinions about what's a priority for BRICS countries. Should it be the internal cooperation among the 5 big powers, or should their priority be their involvement of international issues like some of the hotspots areas like Korean Peninsula nuclear issue and of course climate change, things like that. I think so far obviously they have been quite focusing on the internal cooperation among the 5 powers. Like for example, China has imported a lot more stuff from the rest of the 4 countries than from the average foreign trade with other countries. You know, the latest figure is about more than 33% Chinese import from the rest of the 4 countries, and from South Africa is more than 35%. So I think the cooperation has been going on very well.
Now, President Xi is calling this summit a stronger partnership for a brighter future. Andrea Murta, Brazil is having tough times, isn't it, economically and politically. How has it helped Brazil to be a member of BRICS?
Well, Brazil is in a tricky position right now. Membership is ever more important now, especially because of the turmoil that the country is facing. On the one hand, Brazil is really looking for foreign investment because domestic investment is so low. So being part of a group that has China, Russia, India. China is the biggest commercial partner that Brazil has, and Russia and India are also part of the top 10 economies that Brazil has trade with. So it's extremely important for the country to be part of a group of such greater economies at this moment. Politically also, it's important for them.
Maxime, in Moscow, your country is struggling under the weight of UN and US sanctions, of course. How has it helped Russia to be a member of BRICS?
It's speaking economically, it's not that obvious. I mean, there are sanctions. There is a sanctions problem, and it's much easier for Russia to communicate with its BRICS partners than with the Western world. But politically, the memberships in BRICS has a tremendous impact, and it's of big importance to Russia, because it lets Russia not to feel isolated. And if you remember the G20 summit in Australia, it was a BRICS country who showed the most of solidarity with Russia. And it's still like this. So even when there is a G20 meetings, so there is a separate meetings with BRICS countries, and they usually support each other politically, at least on the level of declarations. So I mean, for Russia, political aspects of being members of BRICS is probably more important than economical aspects.
Yes, that separate communique by the BRICS nations at the last G20, that was certainly an historic moment. Saurabh, in the studio, India has its economic difficulties right now as well. Despite stellar growth over the last handful of years or so, right now GDP is beginning to wane. How is BRICS helping India?
BRICS is important for India from the perspective economically that India has not been adequately integrated into the world economy. It is a large country, but it is not sufficient, doesn't do sufficient amount of trade, import-export trade with other countries in the world. The more it gets integrated, particularly its manufacturing sector, the better it will be. It is not always easy to have trade agreements with many developed countries because some of their demands are fairly stiff. And BRICS provides an arena, along with other forums like the RCEP negotiations, where it can gradually integrate into the world. Secondly, India is also a developing country, and we have the BRICS Bank, and we have other nascent multilateral banks like the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which provide avenues and funds for its own internal development. Yes. So from that perspective, developmental and integrationist, I think it's important for India.
Yes, we haven't mentioned the Development Bank until this moment, and then you can add on to that. Let's come to Shindu out in Beijing. You can add on to that films and sport and youth issues and culture. All of these are areas that I think China would like to see BRICS move much more towards in the future, on top of the cooperation that we've already spoken about.
That's right, especially for this year, you know, if you look at the theme, is a deepening the partnership part of that. So for the Chinese side, of course, you know, like unity or coherence of this very important group, especially if they can speak with one voice, if they are united, obviously they will become more powerful and easy to be heard by the international community. I think the Chinese side stressed very much, this unity. At the same time, China also talked about this internal like exchange of a personnel, exchange of a culture, understanding of a culture. So they have this, like a China year of a BRICS, and also they have the jointly produced movies, and also they have this sports games among the five powers. So all these are, these kind of activities will help enhance the understanding and the exchanges among the five countries. Remember, they are far away from each other. Yes. Like China, Brazil, China, South Africa. Actually, there's a little, very little understanding of each other. If you talk to people, do you know, BRICS and who are the members? A lot of people have probably no information about that.
And yet, Suhab, in the studio, China's bid to increase the size of BRICS membership, the so-called BRICS Plus, was actually blocked by India. Why was that?
It's been a little bit of a tricky affair with regard to India in context of India-China relations. The BRICS would be best served by having more big emerging economies join the BRICS, and then having a platform on the basis of which they can then have development partner to development partner relations with other South-South countries. India, for some reason, one of the main countries which is looking and would like to join BRICS and would be an ideal fit for BRICS is Indonesia. Right. Like India, independent-minded country. It's a very diverse, secular country. It has a large Muslim majority population. But India has just not been forthcoming enough in this regard. It's not entirely clear to me, but I think it's the Indian position which needs to change or evolve over time so that BRICS becomes the premier emerging market and South-South forum, which can then leverage its power in terms of cooperation vis-a-vis many of the developed countries on many of the global challenges.
I wonder if, as Belt and Road develops down the years, whether that will have an impact.
Yes, it will, but I think in any case, the BRICS are moving on a good track in terms of their co-financing of projects in various spheres. I think the new development bank has been a very welcome institution in this regard. And what's important in this space is that it is showing that there is space for a development bank different from people like the World Bank, which really, as you know, the Chinese talk in terms of the AIIB being lean, clean, and green. The new development bank also can be exactly that type of this thing and show how development can be done differently from just that one model which we have which is set up by the World Bank and by the developed countries.
Andrea, in the studio with me, the idea of expansion is not completely off the table, is it? Because President Xi Jinping has invited the likes of, I've got 4 of them down here, Guinea, Thailand, Mexico, and Tajikistan. And I think Egypt is the other country, the so-called BRICS plus 5, who've been invited to take part, but really be on the sidelines this weekend in Xiamen. What role will they play? Why are they being invited then?
Well, for countries like Brazil, I think the more the merrier at this point, especially because Brazil really focuses on the economic aspects of the BRICS, and so they can get cash from wherever they can find it. Brazil is also working on specific agreements with Mexico, for example. So having Mexico there at this moment as part of a group, of a larger group, who helps Brazil in their dialogue. But I think there are structural problems that the BRICS have to overcome before enlarging itself. For example, the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, doesn't have the structural capacity to expand too much at the moment. They have a plan that in 2021 they'll be in every area of the globe, and that's an ambitious plan that we're hoping comes to fruition. But it's still to be seen whether they're going to be able to do that.
And Maxime, in Moscow, does Moscow feel the same way? I mean, there's lots of former Soviet satellites around Russia that I'm sure you would like to bring in some way or another.
It's probably most of all is a Chinese initiative, and I feel it corresponds with One Belt, One Road initiative, so that BRICS to position itself as a leader of emerging market, of the developing world in general, and not just of the biggest economies, the biggest emerging economies. And for Russia is indeed a little bit tricky, because it's difficult to predict who will join BRICS and how will it operate, because it's not secret that it's already a problem of coordination within BRICS. Because of, as my Chinese colleague mentioned, there are 2 different countries, 2 different cultures, and it's difficult to coordinate between them. And if we speak about the expansion, it would be even more difficult. So I believe we should think twice before expanding BRICS and before introducing a BRICS plus or whatever.
Welcome back. We're talking about the 2017 BRICS Summit beginning September the 3rd in the city of Xiamen, China. Let's go back to our panel. And Saurabh, to you first of all, there is a border dispute going on between China and India over a disputed part of Bhutan. It's not clear to me, has that border dispute been set aside so that the summit can go ahead unhindered, or has it actually been resolved?
The immediate issue at this moment has been resolved. India and China have a long-running border dispute which will not be resolved anytime soon, though they have made progress on that front. There was a specific issue with regard to road building in close proximity to the border in one specific area, and there was a standoff in this regard. That has now been resolved. It was resolved, I think, within this last week. One of the important factors to take away, there are 2 important points to take away. One doesn't relate to the BRICS, and that issue is that India and China actually have very, very good boundary management protocols, and basically, they've not lost a life in over 40 years despite having that border dispute, and they managed to coordinate this withdrawal. But the more important point is this. The main leaders realized that they are going to meet at BRICS. They had been in intensive negotiations over the last 2 months, and it was, I feel, the fact that they were going to meet at BRICS and they did not want a cloud over the BRICS meeting that got them to resolve this issue just in time. So BRICS actually played an important role in that regard.
Another issue that caught my eye is that President Xi Jinping and the Chinese are very keen to bring up the issue of protectionism, and I think that that is an indication of their feelings towards Donald Trump policies in Washington, D.C. Now, Xindo in China cares about protectionism. Donald Trump is threatening tariffs on all sorts of issues that may or may not in the future affect the second largest economy in the world. What's the view from Beijing on this?
Yes, this is a big issue, obviously, facing China. I think one of the most like a pressing issue facing China from outside. I think, as I pointed out, like if the 5 countries can speak with one voice, the voice will be much, much louder. I think that they have something in common in terms of globalization. Both as emerging economies, that's fall into their national interests to continue to push forward globalization and to continue to fight the rise of protectionism and also sometimes like economic nationalism.
Okay.
There's talk of economic war against China. So obviously China is on the edge of preparing for the worst, let's say. And because like a country like China, I think like India, they are benefiting a lot from this current international trade system. So they would love to see this open system, this trade or free trade system to continue.
Okay.
But somehow in developed world like the U.S. and Britain, you can see there's a backfire of globalization. So you see the different voices here.
Andrea, President Xi is very keen to move BRICS on into its next phase. That's part of the reason for this summit, as set out in the letter that he sent to all the leaders. How much of a part will the service sector, which of course is very big in the legacy economy, it's very big indeed, how much of a part will the service sector play in future expansion for BRICS?
I think a very big part. They have been very interested in expanding that part of trade specifically, and that's also very aligned with what Brazil is trying to do. There are parts of the Brazilian economy that have shown great potential to grow, and the service sector is part of that, especially in a time where manufacturing and industry are suffering a little bit of a low stage inside Brazil. So that's definitely going to play a big part. It has been stated that all the BRIC countries are interested in increasing that. There has been, they have agreed that they will talk about this specifically in the coming days in this summit. So I think that we should really expect great announcements on that regard.
Saurabh, what are the stumbling blocks going forward? What may trip up BRICS? And indeed, just a sub-question there, is its success dependent on the legacy economies aging rather quicker than had been anticipated that they would?
At the end of the day, for the BRICS to succeed, they need to succeed on their own merit and not because somebody else faded away or somebody else failed. They need to succeed individually as national economies and then as economies which have integrated with each other and into the world economic system. So that is essential for their success. The areas where there are stumbling blocks is because talking economically, politically, there's a commonality on a lot of global challenges. They take very similar positions, and as you will see again in the BRICS joint statement, it's going to be a long one, and on a lot of areas of global challenges, they will have fairly harmonious views. But on the economic side, countries are at different stages in their development. There are different growth models, and also their natural endowments are very different. At one area that does allow for cooperation, but at another point that also provides a stumbling block. So at the end of the day, the degree to which each of them can individually reform themselves will expand the space in which they can economically coordinate and integrate with themselves.
Okay, and finally, can I ask you all to do the impossible? Andrea, just tell us, for you, what would be a successful BRICS? What's the outcome that you're hoping to see? Just in a few words, if you will. For Brazil, this is a sales pitch. So the success looks like good announcements in terms of investments that are going to be made in Brazil in the coming years. There is an expectation of $10 billion to come into Brazil. I think that's a little bit too optimistic, but we'll see what comes out of the meeting. Saurabh, briefly.
This is the BRICS 9 summit. They will complete 1 decade next year. At this point of time, that their horizons look forward as to where they go in the next decade and literally how they expand, the pace at which they expand and how wisely they do that, but how they look forward to the next decade of where the BRICS will be.
Maxime, you're sitting right on the Silk Road there. You know what that means for President Xi. What would be a successful outcome for you?
I think, I believe the BRICS is already a great success because originally it was an artificial test tube baby, but it proves that it can exist and it works and it's expanding, so it's already a success. But the real success for BRICS would be if its voice, the voice of BRICS, the voice of BRICS countries will be heard, and that it will have an impact on the world development. And generally speaking, the real success would be when there is a BRICS summit, there will be a lot of media coverage worldwide. It will mean that the voice of the BRICS country will be really heard.
Well, you're certainly going to get plenty of coverage on this station, of that there's no doubt. And Shindo, this is very important for the city of Xiamen, isn't it? Just very briefly, what would you see as a successful outcome? What will make you smile on Tuesday morning?
Well, yeah, well, I think, you know, as long as their like effects will be felt you know, in the rest of the world. For example, there's this unfairness in the international finance system. You know, like IMF director always comes from European countries. World Bank governor always comes from the United States. So there's also unfair representative in those financial institutes. And also on global, warming, climate change, those countries have a common interests. And on the continuation of the globalization, they also share this common interests. I think as long as they are united and they speak with one voice, and the impact will be felt, that's a success.
Those are truly global issues. Andrea, Sarab, Maxime, and Shindo, thank you all very much indeed for a most interesting conversation. Thank you very much.